This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey guys, this week we bring you another episode from the archives, and I gotta tell you, I'm a little bit sorry to bring you another archive episode relatively close to the last one. But I'm also not really sorry at all because I'll be in the Black Hills doing some rock climbing this week. So while I am off clinging to a rock face, I hope you enjoy spending a little time with Matt Herron as he, Catherine, and I discuss the critical issue of pacing. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Matt, Catherine, and I are going to talk about pacing. So, what is pacing for us fiction writers? Yeah.
Okay. Here's one definition. It's the rhythm of the story, which includes both how fast it moves and also how it looks on the page.
How it looks on the page, like the way the words are typed and formatted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like More Carriage Returns is a faster story, wouldn't you say? James Patterson uses a lot of them.
Right, so really we're talking about shorter paragraph lengths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Things like single sentence or very few sentences in a paragraph, shorter
or a
chapters.
big chunky paragraph that slows you down.
Right, so it's a density of text versus a lightness of text on the page. Right. So that visual cue, plus the more white space, the quicker you turn pages, just because that density is missing. Okay, right. So that is one way to affect your pacing.
Definition.
Right, your use of white space will definitely affect your pacing, but it's that formatting really happens because of the way you write the pace of your story. If you're writing one-page chapters and three-sentence paragraphs, you will have a faster pace, a more white space and such. Mm-hmm. Good. Catherine, what is your definition of pacing?
That's a good question. I think I probably think about it more in terms of the action that's happening or occurring, and how quickly things are unfolding versus whether you're taking your time to explain versus diving right into the next action scene versus the next action scene versus the next action scene. So like whether you're tripping right along or if you're taking that time to really explore what's going on is kind of how I view pacing.
Okay, so it's a balance of action versus narrative exposition combined with the actual physical structure of your sentences and paragraphs that will ultimately create the pace of your story. Right? Is that a good definition of pacing? Summary. Right? Works?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So how do you decide whether to write a fast-paced story or a more leisurely paced story?
I would say it has some to do with the genre that you're writing and the kind of story that you want to tell. So if you're writing in a more literary genre or something where you want to be able to explore a quieter part of life, then you're going to write maybe a slower paced book. Whereas if you're writing a thriller, not so much. It's going to be a faster paced book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what else factors into this?
What you like to read?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, in voice, your own personal style has to factor into it. So you could write a thriller that's very descriptive and has a lot of narrative exposition, provided you can create mounting tension while you execute that narrative exposition, you know?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So have you read any books that were heavy on narrative and yet felt fast-paced?
I would say probably some Stephen King books feel like that because he wanders around a lot, but there's always that, unanswered question at the back of your mind about what's going on in this weird haunted town or whether the girl lost in the woods is going to make it out alive,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great example. Stephen King, and another one that I have on my bookshelf is Blood Harvest by S.J. Bolton, which is a psychological thriller, and it's full of tension because of the mystery, because of those unanswered questions being raised. So even though it's more of a literary narrative, it's full of description and it's got multiple points of view. So you're getting inside multiple characters' experiences and really going into different aspects of this story. There was never a moment when I wasn't fully engaged, going, oh my God, what is going to happen next? So, yeah, those are really great examples of creating a thrilling experience, but still writing a narrative-rich story.
Mm-hmm. So I guess because of my background in music, when I think pacing, I think tempo. Mm-hmm. So I think like a steady beat in the background. And so when I think of a faster paced book, I'm thinking that I'm reading at a faster, like like here I go, like right down the page, like, whereas when you have a slower pace, everything kind of just relaxes down into a slower tempo. Like, is that a fair thought process, I guess?
No. No, like I know what you mean by that. I think that when we are gripped by a story, when we have that intensity of emotional engagement, we do read faster because we're trying to see what's going to happen next. So it's kind of like your heartbeat picking up because you're excited. It's an adrenaline thing, not necessarily a words on the page thing. If you were doing a spoken word piece, you could write very short staccato sentences with a lot of white space around them, and you would have that rhythmic effect. But if you are writing a description of a setting, you won't have that same kind of like beat to it, but you could still have that adrenaline type of tension.
Yeah. I was thinking about the book, The Da Vinci Code, that has a lot of, like myth telling. It's like pages and pages of narrative, but it's still really fast paced because of the unknown element. Mm-hmm. And also, like, somebody's always trying to kill them.
Right. Yeah, so good. That brings up another point about pacing, is that one thing that heightens or intensifies the pace of a book is the element of danger. So when your reader cares about your characters and your characters are in danger, then we get that intensification of emotion where we want to see, will they survive? How will they react to this? So danger gives us a greater pace.
Okay.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that there can't be danger, like if, it doesn't have to be somebody's trying to kill you. That's like a lot of mysteries and thrillers use that, but it doesn't have to be that. Something could be dangerous in a romance too, but in a different way, right? Like it could be like an emotional danger.
Right, absolutely. Anytime you have that I need to know right now feeling, like I remember when my daughter was very little, like a baby, I'd go to TJ Maxx and buy the Harry Potter books in hardcover because you could get them at like half price, at TJ Maxx. And my ex worked all the time and we had one car, so I was really stuck at home with this little baby. So I remember sitting on the kitchen chair reading the Harry Potter books while I'm feeding her, like, oops, did I miss your mouth? Oh, well. And that's pacing. And those are very narrative-rich books with a ton of description, but because I was so engaged with all the magical elements and this crazy setting and these wild characters, I kept turning the pages. It was one of those books I couldn't put down, and it wasn't because Harry's life was in danger at every turn, right? You do have a rhythm to a story, and you need to give your readers a rest. There was a book I read called Island 71, 41, Islands something. I'd have to go look it up. And these people on a boat end up stuck on this island, which turns out to have been a Japanese research island during World War II, which was abandoned after the war. But research kept going, and it's basically the island of Dr. Moreau. It's a retelling of that in the modern world. So you've got these chimeras, and the people from the ship end up on the island, and it's threat after threat after threat after threat, and each monster is bigger and badder than the one before. And the characters never stop running. Like, they never eat, they never sleep, they never treat their wounds. They're just like it was explosion after explosion, cliffhanger after cliffhanger. Chapters were short, the action was intense, and it was fatiguing. It was just, I know, I was like, really? Hello? Like, okay, you lost me on the plausibility because nobody could sustain that many injuries and keep going.
Yeah. So if you were to go back to like definitions of pacing, you could say it's the way, like if we use the Harry Potter books, it's the way a writer pulls somebody through the story quickly, but also knows when to give them a break.
Right. Yeah, I think pacing is really about reader engagement. I read Marilynne Robinson's book. I'd have to look it up to get the title, which I should do. But I can add it to the video in text. It won a Pulitzer, I believe. So should have been a great book, and I didn't finish it because the pace was so slow. It was, this old man who was a preacher in a rural community, married a young woman, had a young son, and found out he was dying, so he was writing letters to his son so that his son would know him after he had died. So right there, the setup is very low tension, right? Yeah, very introspective, very quiet. You don't expect it to be fast-paced, and it was a very well-written, great book. I just needed something more engaging at that time, Yeah. So I think as someone who thinks a lot and who writes and who is in her head processing a lot, that kind of story, it was like more of the same. It was like too much here when I needed some of this. I needed a ride to go on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it brings up a good point too, because like you might want to read different paced things. Like sometimes I'm in the mood for a slow, like literary tome, and sometimes I would rather read the genre Pulp Fiction, anything that goes fast, anything.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and you can have both. I think the Blood Harvest book and, King's books, those are good examples where you can have a rich literary experience that is also a genre story. Have you guys read The Last Werewolf? I think it's Glenn Duncan. That book is, it starts out fantastic. It's the guy's a werewolf, so he's not quite immortal, but he's, hundreds of years old. So you start in this historical setting and you move up to today, and he's dealing with his conscience as he accepts being a beast that has to eat human beings once a month, right, in order to survive.
Right.
And that was fascinating, and it was sort of this nice blend of the philosophical, with him being the last werewolf and dealing with his conscience, and then the literary historical elements. But then in the last third or so of the book, all of a sudden there were vampires and espionage, and people were out to get him. And then he was in an airport and he smelled another werewolf, and of course it was a female. And so now, now there's a sequel coming, and I was like, okay, did your publisher do this to you? Did you write this lovely literary werewolf fantasy? And then they're like, okay, now make it the Da Vinci Code, or now make it
not enough espionage.
Right. Now give it some thriller stuff.
Yeah. But some of those, so I haven't read this book, so I don't know if he does this, but you were talking about how he was centuries old and it started as a historical and they were time hopping. That can be really thrilling. Like if you read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth, I think it's called.
Okay, I haven't read that.
So Ken Follett's really interesting. He writes thrillers, he wrote spy thrillers for a long time, and then he wrote this epic 3-generation novel about this family and this architect that builds cathedrals. And cathedrals back in England, and I don't know, I guess it was 1200s, 1400s, took months, years to build. Years. So they would spend years and then pass it on to their children, who would spend years finishing this cathedral. And it was just this massive story, but it was so cool because the scale was so huge. And so it's very slow at points, and it's family drama, but I was ripped the whole time because it was just such a big concept that I was just in awe. And so I couldn't stop reading. And I don't know if, because like I said, he started writing thrillers, so maybe he just got really good at getting keeping people gripped, and then he was able to stretch it out for something like Pillars of the Earth, which is huge. It's 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
That's a really cool skill.
That is very cool.
And Steinbeck kind of does that too with what was the one, East of Eden? If you can get into that one, because it spans so many generations and it really pulls you along because you see how things change.
Right. And who's the writer who's got the thing at UT? The writing program is named for him or something.
Michener?
Michener. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's known for writing these huge, epic books where the landscape is a big part of it. The country, the politics, the era, the land itself. And he's writing Westerns, and, so there's definitely a gripping genre component to these sprawling, epic literary feats.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ways you can write a gripping story. I guess if you wanted to get tactical, you said danger earlier.
Yep.
Wonder, I guess you would call these big sprawling ones. They grip you because you're just amazed.
Fascinated
that it's possible,
by them.
Right?
Yeah.
Fascinated, wonder. Yeah. What other specific techniques could you use if you were crafting a story that you wanted to just pull people in?
Right. Well, okay, let's go back to what Catherine first raised about genre. So if you're writing a thriller and you want it to be fast-paced, you're probably going to focus more on technology than on scenery, and you're going to have lots of danger throughout the story. But if you're writing something like, a historical vampire story, I'm thinking of Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, of course, then you're going to combine setting, historical period, danger, mystery, all of those elements, the morality, the conscience that I was talking about with Duncan's The Last Werewolf. Louis deals with that in Interview with the Vampire. So with Harry Potter, it's the magic that is so fun, right? So it really is about reader engagement. It's not just about lots of action happening really fast on the page.
Right.
That is one way to try to do it, but then the risk there is that you end up with a shallow story without depth of character, without visual evocative settings, and without real reader engagement. Because if it's just action like that, it's Island 731. I didn't care about those characters. I don't think I'll ever read another one of this guy's books as a result, So some people get off on that, some people don't. It's really...
Right.
What do you like to read? What do you like to write? And do you know your audience?
Yeah.
Sure. And there are tons of books that hit bestseller list and people say are great, and I read them and I'm like, I just can't read it. But some people love it, so, know your reader, I guess. Know what kind of pace they like. Know your genre, like Catherine said earlier.
Yeah, so pacing, there is no value judgment that fast-paced is good and slow-paced is bad. It's like Marilyn Robinson's book that won the Pulitzer. It's not a bad thing that it was slow-paced. It just wasn't the book I was in the mood for at that time.
Well, and if you cared about the character, like if you really got into the character, you probably would care about those introspective moments. Like if you were in for that kind of pace and you were like, I know this is going to be an introspective and I care deeply about that father-son relationship, then you will get pulled through the story based on that depth of character. Like you were saying, like it matters and you're pulled through from the emotional things that are happening.
Yes.
Pacing-wise.
Yeah, so emotional pacing as well as action pacing. Pacing isn't a single layer in a story. There are multiple layers to it. So just like Matt was saying, that danger can be like a relationship danger, that sort of tension, not just as a bomb going to explode.
Yeah. Nice.
Yep. Nice, yep. All right. I think we just finished up on the pacing conversation.
Yeah. I like all the book examples. A lot of people talk about, movies when it comes to pacing. It's nice to think about how it's done in novels.
Yes, definitely. And as writers, that's where we should turn for our pacing, not to movies. I use a lot of movies as examples because a story is a story and they can be great, but it's such a different medium than literature. So you really can't go to a movie as a pacing example because they have so many more aspects, so much more sensory input for the reader. And you're trying to create that experience for a reader with words, but you've got to balance the elements differently. Yeah,
definitely.
That's a really good point.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.